Welcome into LX News, everybody. I'm Ashley Holt. Thanks for joining us. Tuesday was the second day of the federal trial for the three former Minneapolis police officers charged in George Floyd's murder. The three officers are each charged with violating his civil rights for failing to give Floyd medical aid as Derek Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds.
My brother had the weight of 4 officers on him, and the fact that the world, he was basically carrying the weight for the world when he had those officers on him because of systemic racism that plagued our nation for years.
That is Floyd's brother there. Now in the U.S., we don't often see federal civil rights charges filed against rank-and-file officers for not stopping the actions of a superior officer. So as the New York Times puts it, it appears what's really on trial is police culture. That said, we want to have the bigger conversation around the main question this trial presents. What is the role of the other officers? Meaning, if an officer is engaging with someone using excessive force, what are the officers standing around that person trained to do or not do? And is it enough? Those of us who watched that horrifying body cam footage saw then officers Thomas Kiernan Lane, Toe Tao, and J. Alexander King react to Chauvin in different ways, whether it was assisting him or sometimes questioning him, but none of them jumped in to stop him. And there could be a reason why. Let's take a trip to Sunrise, Florida. Earlier this year, shocking video showed a female police officer try to de-escalate a physical altercation between Sunrise Police Sergeant Christopher Police and a person considered a suspect who was handcuffed and already in a police car. You can see the sergeant then turns around and appears to choke his fellow officer for trying to stop him. Then there's Cariel Horn in Buffalo, New York. During an arrest in 2006, the former Buffalo police officer tried to stop a fellow officer who had a man in handcuffs in an illegal chokehold. The two officers then got into a physical altercation. She was fired after 20 years of service and her pension revoked. In April 2021, after a 14-year battle, her termination was reversed and her pension was finally restored by a New York State Supreme Court judge who said the city of Buffalo has recognized the error and has acknowledged the need to undo an injustice from the past. The legal system can, at the very least, be the mechanism to help justice prevail, even if belatedly. Now Horn fights for legislation she helped write called Cariel's Law. It says officers will stand prosecution if they stand idle when a colleague uses excessive force. The legislation was enacted in Buffalo in 2020 and was under review to become state law in New York as recently as May 2020.
We don't want other officers to go through what I've gone through, but we don't want other victims to go through what George Floyd went through.
Joining me now to have this discussion about other officers seeing and saying something is Cariel Horn herself here. We're also joined by Linda R. Williams, who is a veteran of the U.S. Secret Service and a professor in Middle Tennessee State University's Department of Criminal Justice Administration. Cariel, I have to start with you. Lots of people just hearing your story for the very first time. Neil Mack, the man who was choked by your former colleague, says that you saved his life. He says it any and everywhere he can say that. Do you believe that legislation like the one you helped write could have saved George Floyd's life?
I most certainly believe that that is exactly why we need Cariel's Law. And yes, it could have, because it's not only just the duty to intervene, but it protects the officers who do intervene.
Linda, in law enforcement, what are officers trained to do in a situation like this? Or is there training at all if they see a colleague that they believe is using excessive force?
So thank you for having me. There's no national standards, and even as the past president of Noble, we push for that legislation. I thank Carol for her boldness to intervene as she was supposed to. That it's a shame that it should be a law to tell us to do what is right to preserve human life. And so again, every department trains differently, but that's the push for national standards so that there is an obligation to intervene when excessive force is no longer needed.
Cariel, did it ever cross your mind that you would get in trouble for doing something that you felt in that moment was the only right thing to do?
I certainly did not believe that I would have to go through what I have gone through. And that is exactly why I wrote Cariel's Law, because I did not want another officer to have to go through it after I've done everything and taken all of the steps to improve it. So no, I did not know that I would get into trouble, not like I did.
Yeah. Cariel, what do you hope your story does to this blue wall of silence that so many officers are afraid to break?
Well, I hope it breaks it down because, like in Carrier, with Carrier's law, it's not just the duty to intervene. It mandates an officer to intervene. It protects an officer who does intervene, and it penalizes or criminalizes the one that doesn't. But at the same time, it goes retroactive. So in the city of Buffalo, we have Carrier's law, where it goes back 20 years. And that is what was used to help me get my pension, which I'm still in the process of getting, but
Wow.
uh, and to overturn the termination.
Yeah. So, Linda, anytime we have any conversation that impacts a large group of people, there's the conversation and there's the subtext of the conversation, right? So, can you help explain to people what the subtext is of this conversation for people who don't understand because we have never been in law enforcement? Why does this even have to be a conversation? What is the fear there that you think many officers have that may be valid?
So, we have gone through a tumultuous year, the last couple years, where the credibility of law enforcement has diminished. We are the guardians of our communities, not warriors. And so, in order to build that trust, and, again, I applaud my sister for her boldness so many years ago to be able to do that because she was going against the grain that should already be established and supposed to do. So, this is showing the whole community and showing the country that law enforcement is here to serve and protect and not to be occupying forces or some, superior beings that, penalize and traumatize the community. And so this is setting a stage for transformation, accountability, and transparency. But more importantly, there are consequences when you don't do what you're supposed to do.
So, Cariel, I wonder what you say to police officers who are still serving, and I wonder if they've even come up to you. But what do you say to those who take your story as a cautionary tale for what not to do? Because they don't have the fight you have to fight for a pension for a lot of years and to be fired, and they don't want to go through all the attention. What do you say to people, officers, who feel that way?
Well, first of all, you have to have a moral obligation to do it. You have to understand that we can put as many laws as we want into place, but if you don't stand up for what's right, and you rather do it for a paycheck, then you're in the wrong profession. Um, so, like I said, Carrier's law needs to be in every city, state, any jurisdiction. Where you have police, you need Carrier's law because it's more than just the duty to intervene. It protects an officer who does intervene.
Yeah. And Cariel, Linda spoke earlier about how there's no federal standard. Do you think that's part of the issue as well?
It's definitely the issue, and I would like to make it a federal standard. So that's what I'm trying to do is to push it nationally.
Yeah. Linda, if you were to write the curriculum for officers on what to do when they feel like they should step in, what would you call chapter 1? Where does this conversation start when you're training new officers?
It's funny that you should ask that question. And as a professor of criminal justice that deal with tomorrow's leaders, do the right thing. Do the right thing. Like Carol said, it didn't have to have a law for her to know to do the correct thing. And sometimes it's not comfortable, it's not easy. But when we don't leave it to happenstance and that is an obligation, that you realize these are your responsibilities and the consequences to them, that it's the passion that leads us into law enforcement. It's not a get-rich occupation. It's because we care and that we're passionate about the community that we raised our hand to serve. So do the right thing, even when no one's looking. And if you use that as a rule, that'll be your guide and it'll hold you throughout your career.
Cariel, how has your experience changed you?
It's changed me in a lot of ways. I didn't want another officer to go through what I had gone through. So I felt that I not only wanted to do it, I felt like I had an obligation to create a solution so that they wouldn't have to go through it. And that is why I fought so long, because I have children. So if they wanted to be on the police department, I did not want them to have to go through the same thing. We need to get together and write that curriculum because I would love to be a part of that.
Cariel Horn, Linda R. Williams, thank you so much for being willing to come here and have this conversation. I have truly appreciated and enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. On Monday, prosecutors and the defense team gave their opening arguments in the civil rights trial. The prosecutor arguing these 3 CPR-trained officers stood as Chauvin killed a man slowly in front of their eyes. They chose not to save Mr. Floyd. But a lawyer for one of the officers is arguing Chauvin called all of the shots as the senior officer at the scene and criticized the Minneapolis Police Department for doing too little to train officers to intervene when a colleague should be stopped. All of the arguments presented in this case inevitably bring us back to discussions about the blue wall of silence, which the New York Times defines as the code that calls on cops to protect one another against charges of brutality and criminality. But we saw the wall start to crumble in Derek Chauvin's trial. And if the other 3 officers are convicted, some would consider it another step taken to dismantle the police culture we discussed earlier. Last year, I had a conversation with civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump about it and what putting it on trial means for all of us. I'm going to play part of our discussion, but you can watch all of it from start to finish over at lx.com.
These police officers come in to pierce the blue wall of silence, coming out testifying against the police. That's something that I had never seen in my professional career. And I see it in you and the professionals who are being able to excel at a level that we've never been able to excel at. And so I think about all the journalists of color who are now getting opportunities because of what happened to George Floyd, and that you see these corporations saying, we have to do better. We have to do better as a society, America.